The auction hammer hung suspended in midair, trembling in Sheriff Cornelius Vance's weathered grip. His steel-gray eyes swept across the packed arena, where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the barn's weathered slats. The crowd had fallen silent, their collective breath held as they witnessed something that would be whispered about for generations. 16-year-old Magnolia Winters stood alone in the center of the arena, her worn boots planted firmly in the dirt, $1 bill clutched in her small fist. The massive stallion beside her, a magnificent creature with a coat black as midnight, and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, had just performed the impossible. As the sheriff's men had approached with ropes and tranquilizer guns, the horse had slowly, deliberately, lowered his great head in a bow so profound, so reverent, that even the most hardened ranchers felt their hearts skip. The sheriff's face had turned the color of Oklahoma clay. "Girl, you will not make a mockery of this legal proceeding," he had thundered moments before, his voice echoing off the barn walls. "That horse is property of the state, seized for unpaid taxes. The minimum bid is $5,000. But Magnolia had stepped forward anyway, her voice clear and unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. $1, she had called out, and the stallion had moved to her side as if summoned by forces beyond human understanding. The crowd rustled with nervous energy. Cattlemen who had driven from 3 counties away to bid on Jeremiah Winters' legendary horses now found themselves witnessing something that defied explanation. The old-timers recognized the signs they had heard stories from their grandfathers about horses that chose their riders, about bonds that transcended ownership and law. Magnolia's grandfather, Jeremiah, had been the finest horse trainer in 5 states before his death 3 months prior. His ranch, Whispering Meadows, had been home to horses that seemed to dance with their riders, that could read human hearts like open books. But unpaid medical bills and a reverse mortgage had left his granddaughter with nothing but memories and the clothes on her back. The sheriff stepped down from his platform, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "Miss Winters, I'll have you removed from this property if you don't cease this foolishness immediately." But as he approached, the stallion known to everyone as Midnight's promise stepped protectively in front of Magnolia. The horse's dark eyes held an intelligence that made grown men step back, and his presence seemed to fill the entire arena with an otherworldly energy. "He knows," whispered old Beauregard Hutchins from the front row, his gnarled hands gripping his walking stick. "That horse knows what's happening here." The auctioneer, a thin man named Quincy Ashford, looked between the sheriff and the girl with growing unease. In 30 years of conducting auctions, he had never seen anything like this. The horse hadn't. Just Bodie had communicated something profound, something that touched the very soul of everyone present. Sheriff Vance's hand moved to his holster, but before he could speak, a voice from the crowd called out, "Let her bid stand." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and suddenly, the simple auction had become something far more significant, a test of justice, tradition, and the mysterious bond between a girl and a horse that refused to be broken. The voice that had called out belonged to Cordelia Blackthorne, the wealthiest rancher in the county, and a woman whose word carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. She stood slowly, her silver hair catching the light like spun moonbeams, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the arena. "Sheriff Vance," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. "I believe we need to examine the legality of this proceeding." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to dismiss Cordelia outright. She owned half the county and had the legal resources to tie up any decision in court for years. "Mrs. Blackthorne, with all due respect, this is a legal seizure. The girl has no standing here." But Cordelia was already moving toward the center of the arena, her boots clicking against the wooden steps as she descended from the bleachers. The crowd parted before her like water before the bow of a ship. According to Oklahoma state law, any citizen can bid at a public auction. The minimum bid requirement applies only when there are no competing bids. This young lady has made a valid offer. Magnolia felt her heart racing as the powerful woman approached. She had heard stories about Cordelia Blackthorne, how she had transformed a failing cattle ranch into a thoroughbred empire, how she had never married, but had mentored dozens of young horsemen and women over the decades. Furthermore, Cordelia continued, her eyes never leaving the sheriff's face, I question whether this seizure was properly executed. Jeremiah Winter's estate is still in probate, and I have reason to believe his granddaughter has legal standing as a potential heir. The stallion remained perfectly still beside Magnolia, but his ears were pricked forward, as if he understood every word being spoken. Occasionally, he would nuzzle Magnolia's shoulder with such gentleness that several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Quincy Ashford, the auctioneer, found himself in an impossible position. He had been hired by the county to conduct a simple seizure auction, but now he was caught between the sheriff's authority and the most powerful rancher in the region. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed nervously. I need to consult my legal guidelines, he stammered, reaching for a worn leather folder, but before he could open it, another voice rang out from the crowd. I'll bid $2, every head turned to see Hawthorne McAllister, a young rancher known for his gentle way with horses. He stood with his head in his hands, his face flushed with emotion. That horse don't belong to no government, he said, his voice growing stronger. He belongs with someone who understands him. The sheriff's face darkened. Mr. McAllister, I'll remind you that interfering with a legal proceeding is a criminal offense. But the dam had broken. Another voice called out, $3, then another, $5. What started as a few brave souls soon became a chorus of support. Ranchers, farmhands, and townspeople who had never spoken up against authority in their lives found themselves bidding, not because they wanted the horse, but because they understood that something precious was being destroyed by cold bureaucracy. Magnolia watched in amazement as the community that had seemed so distant since her grandfather's death rallied around her. These people had known Jeremiah Winters, had seen him work magic with horses that others had given up on. They understood that Midnight's promise wasn't just an animal, he was a living connection to a tradition that was rapidly disappearing from the world. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, his face now showing the strain of a man whose authority was being challenged by an entire community. Enough, he shouted. This auction will proceed according to the law, and the law alone. But even as he spoke, Midnight's promise took another step closer to Magnolia, lowering his great head until his muzzle rested gently against her cheek. The gesture was so tender, so obviously protective, that even the sheriff's deputies seemed moved by it. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and everyone in the arena knew that this was about far more than one horse and one girl. It was about the soul of their community. Sheriff Vance's radio crackled to life, and he stepped away from the crowd to answer it. The brief conversation was tense, filled with hushed words and sharp nods. When he returned, his expression had hardened into something resembling granite. I've just received word from the county attorney, he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent arena. This auction will proceed as scheduled. Anyone interfering with this legal process will be arrested for obstruction of justice. The threat hung heavy in the air, but something had shifted in the crowd's mood. What had begun as a simple auction had transformed into something deeper, a test of community values against bureaucratic power. Magnolia felt Midnight's promise shift beside her, the great horse's muscles tensing as if he sensed the growing tension. She placed a gentle hand on his neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his midnight coat. Her grandfather had always told her that horses could sense human emotions, that they responded to fear and courage in equal measure. Sheriff Cordelia Blackthorn's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I'm prepared to make this very simple. She reached into her purse and withdrew a checkbook, her movements deliberate and controlled. I'll bid $50,000. For the horse, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. $50,000 was more than most people in the county made in 2 years. More than enough to satisfy whatever debt the state claimed against Jeremiah's estate. But before the sheriff could respond, Magnolia stepped forward. No, ma'am, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't about money anymore. She turned to face the crowd, her young face showing a maturity beyond her years. My grandfather always said that a horse chooses its rider, not the other way around. Midnight's promise has made his choice. As if summoned by her words, the stallion moved closer to her side. His dark eyes surveyed the crowd with an intelligence that seemed almost human. And when his gaze fell upon the sheriff, there was something unmistakably challenging in his expression. The sheriff's hand moved to his radio again. "I'm calling for backup," he announced. "The situation has gone on long enough. The horse will be tranquilized and removed from the premises." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Midnight's promise stepped forward, positioning himself between Magnolia and the sheriff. Then, slowly and deliberately, he performed the same bow that had stunned the crowd earlier, but this time, he held the position longer, his great head nearly touching the ground. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Beauregard Hutchins, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped his walking stick. "I ain't never seen nothing like that in all my born days." The horse's bow seemed to ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. People who had been sitting stood up. Those who had been whispering fell silent. Even the sheriff's deputies seemed transfixed by the sight. But it was Hawthorne McAllister who broke the silence. "Sheriff, with all due respect, maybe we ought to think about what we're doing here." "The law is the law, Mr. McAllister," Vance replied. But his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "Is it?" Cordelia Blackthorne's voice carried a new edge. "Because I've been making some calls while we've been standing here." She held up her cell phone. "Judge Morrison is very interested in reviewing the paperwork for the seizure. It seems there may have been some irregularities in the process." The sheriff's face went pale. Judge Morrison was known for his strict interpretation of legal procedures, and irregularities in a seizure could invalidate the entire process. Furthermore, Cordelia continued, "I've just spoken with the estate attorney. It appears that Miss Winters may indeed have legal standing as Jeremiah's heir, which would make this entire auction premature." The words hit the sheriff like a physical blow. If Magnolia had legal standing, then the seizure itself might be illegal. He looked around the arena, suddenly aware that every eye was upon him, that his next decision would define not just this moment, but his entire career. In the center of it all, a 16-year-old girl stood beside a horse that had somehow managed to touch the hearts of an entire community. And the sheriff realized that he was facing something far more powerful than any law he had ever enforced. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as Sheriff Vance's backup arrived, but something in the arena had fundamentally changed. The crowd, once merely curious spectators, had become something else entirely, a community united in protection of something they recognized as sacred. Midnight's promise remained in his bow position, but now other horses in the holding pens began responding to his presence. A beautiful chestnut mare whinnied softly, her call answered by a painted gelding in the adjacent pen. Soon, every horse on the property was calling out, their voices creating a symphony that seemed to speak directly to the human heart. Deputy Marshal Fletcher Donovan was the first to arrive, his squad car kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled to a stop outside the arena. But as he stepped through the entrance, he froze. The sight before him was unlike anything he had encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. The entire crowd had linked arms around the perimeter of the arena, forming a human chain that encircled Magnolia and Midnight's promise. They weren't threatening or aggressive, they simply stood in silent solidarity, their faces showing a determination that ran deeper than any law. "Sheriff," Deputy Donovan said quietly, "what exactly is the situation here?" But before Vance could answer, Dr. Evangeline Thorne pushed through the crowd. The elderly veterinarian had been treating animals in the county for over 40 years, and her presence immediately commanded respect. Her white hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands carried the gentle authority of someone who had spent a lifetime healing. "Sheriff Vance," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "I need to examine this horse before any further action is taken." "Dr. Thorne, this is a legal proceeding, not a veterinary examination," the sheriff replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Actually, it is," she said, producing a folded document from her bag. "I've just received a court order from Judge Morrison requiring a full veterinary and behavioral assessment before any seizure can be completed." The sheriff's face went ashen. Judge Morrison's involvement meant that the entire proceeding was now under judicial scrutiny. Dr. Thorne approached Midnight's promise slowly, her movements careful and respectful. The stallion lifted his head from his bow position and regarded her with intelligent eyes. As she drew closer, something remarkable happened. The horse extended his neck toward her, allowing her to examine him without any sign of fear or aggression. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Thorne murmured as she ran her hands along the horse's neck and shoulders. "His muscle tone is perfect, his breathing is calm, and his response to human contact is, well, it's unlike anything I've seen." She stepped back and turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've examined thousands of horses in my career, but I've never encountered an animal with this level of emotional intelligence. This horse isn't just responding to the situation, he's actively communicating." As if to prove her point, Midnight's promise moved to Magnolia's side and gently nuzzled her hand. The gesture was so tender, so obviously protective, that several people in the crowd began to openly weep. Cordelia Blackthorne stepped forward. "Dr. Thorne, in your professional opinion, what would be the psychological impact of separating this horse from Miss Winters?" The veterinarian's expression grew grave. "It would be devastating. This level of bonding is rare, but when it occurs, separation can cause severe depression, refusal to eat, and in extreme cases, death. I've seen horses die of what can only be described as a broken heart." The sheriff looked around the arena, suddenly aware that he was facing something far beyond his authority. The crowd's silence was more powerful than any shouting could have been, and the horse's obvious devotion to the girl had transformed what should have been a simple seizure into something that touched the very soul of the community. Deputy Donovan approached his superior quietly. "Sheriff, maybe we should consider postponing this action until the legal questions are resolved." But before the sheriff could respond, Magnolia spoke up, her voice carrying across the arena with surprising strength. "I want to tell you all something about this horse," she said, her hand resting on Midnight's promise's neck. "Something my grandfather told me before he died." The crowd leaned forward, sensing that she was about to reveal something important. "Midnight's promise isn't just any horse," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "He's a direct descendant of the last wild Mustang herd that roamed this land. My grandfather spent 30 years earning his trust, and he told me that promise would only bow to someone he considered family." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Everyone knew the stories of the wild Mustang herds that had once thundered across the Oklahoma plains, and the idea that this magnificent creature carried that legacy in his blood made him seem even more precious. The sheriff found himself at a crossroads, facing a decision that would define not just his career, but his very soul. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the arena as the standoff entered its fourth hour. News of the confrontation had spread throughout the county, and vehicles continued to arrive: pickup trucks, horse trailers, and even a few motorcycles carrying people who had driven from as far as 3 counties away. Sheriff Vance stood apart from the crowd, his radio crackling with increasingly urgent messages from the county attorney's office. The situation had escalated beyond a simple seizure auction and was now threatening to become a public relations nightmare for the county government. "Sheriff," Deputy Donovan approached quietly, "we've got news crews setting up outside. This thing is going to be on the evening news." Vance closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the moment. In his 23 years as sheriff, he had always prided himself on following the law without exception, but he had never faced a situation where the law seemed to conflict so directly with justice. In the center of the arena, Magnolia sat cross-legged beside Midnight's promise, her hand resting on the horse's neck. The stallion had remained calm throughout the ordeal, but his eyes never left the sheriff, as if he understood that this man held the power to determine his fate. Cordelia Blackthorne had been making phone calls for the past hour, her voice growing more animated with each conversation. Finally, she approached the sheriff with a satisfied expression. "Sheriff Vance," she said, "I've just spoken with the county attorney, the probate judge, and the estate administrator. The legal situation is quite clear. Miss Winters has full legal standing as Jeremiah's heir, and the seizure was premature. The sheriff's shoulders sagged slightly. "Are you certain about this, Mrs. Blackthorne?" "Absolutely. The paperwork is being faxed to Judge Morrison's office as we speak. Furthermore, I've arranged for a full settlement of any outstanding debts against the estate." This entire proceeding was unnecessary. But even as she spoke, Magnolia stood up and addressed the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for what you've done here today," she said, her voice carrying despite her youth. "But I need you all to understand something. This isn't just about saving one horse." She paused, looking around at the faces of people who had become her unexpected allies. "This is about remembering who we are as a community. My grandfather always said that the measure of a people isn't how they treat the powerful, but how they protect the vulnerable." Midnight's promise stood beside her, his magnificent head held high, his dark eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. The horse seemed to sense that something important was happening, and his stillness commanded attention from every person present. "Every horse my grandfather trained carried a piece of this land's history," Magnolia continued. "They're not just animals, they're living connections to the wild spirit that once defined this place. When we let bureaucracy destroy that connection, we lose something that can never be replaced." Her words resonated through the crowd, touching something deep in the hearts of people who had grown up with stories of the Old West, who remembered when the relationship between humans and horses was about partnership rather than ownership. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, her weathered face showing a mixture of pride and determination. "This young lady speaks wisdom beyond her years," she said to the crowd. "I've spent my entire career working with animals, and I can tell you that what we've witnessed here today is nothing short of miraculous." She turned to face the sheriff directly. "Sheriff Vance, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father was a good man who understood the difference between law and justice. I'm asking you to consider what he would do in this situation." The mention of his father hit the sheriff like a physical blow. Robert Vance had been sheriff before him, a man known for his wisdom and compassion. He had always taught his son that the law was meant to serve the people, not the other way around. As the sheriff struggled with his decision, something unexpected happened. The horses in the holding pens began moving toward the fence closest to Midnight's promise. They pressed against the barriers, their heads extended toward the stallion, as if trying to offer their support. The sight was so moving that even the most hardened ranchers felt tears in their eyes. Here was a community of animals responding to the crisis facing one of their own, and their silent solidarity seemed to mirror the human community that had gathered to protect them. Hawthorne McAllister walked over to the sheriff, his head in his hands. "Sheriff, I know you're in a tough spot," he said quietly, "but sometimes doing the right thing means going against the easy thing." The sheriff looked around the arena one more time, taking in the faces of his neighbors, the horses pressing against their pens, and the girl who had somehow managed to unite them all. He realized that this moment would define not just his career, but his legacy. The arena fell silent as Sheriff Vance walked slowly toward the center, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Every eye followed his movement, and even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Magnolia stood beside Midnight's promise, her hand resting on the stallion's neck, her young face showing a courage that belied her years. The sheriff stopped a few feet away from the girl and the horse, his weathered face showing the weight of the decision he was about to make. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the magnificent creature that had somehow managed to unite an entire community. "Miss Winters," he said finally, his voice carrying across the silent arena, "I've been sheriff of this county for over 20 years. In all that time, I've never encountered a situation quite like this one." He paused, looking around at the faces of the people who had gathered to support the girl. "The law is important," he continued, "but so is justice, and sometimes the two don't always align." Midnight's promise turned his great head toward the sheriff, his dark eyes meeting the lawman's gaze directly. For a moment, man and horse seemed to communicate on a level that transcended words. "Dr. Thorne," the sheriff called out, "you mentioned that separating this horse from Miss Winters could cause severe psychological damage. In your professional opinion, would that constitute animal cruelty?" The veterinarian stepped forward, understanding immediately what the sheriff was asking. In my professional opinion, yes. Separating a horse from a human with whom he has formed this level of bond would constitute cruelty to animals. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then I have no choice but to suspend this seizure pending a full investigation into the welfare of the animals involved. A cheer rose from the crowd, but the sheriff held up his hand for silence. However, he continued, Miss Winters, you understand that this is only a temporary reprieve. The legal issues surrounding your grandfather's estate still need to be resolved. But Cordelia Blackthorne was already stepping forward with a folder in her hands. Sheriff, those issues have been resolved. She handed him a set of documents. The probate court has officially recognized Miss Winters as the sole heir to Jeremiah's estate. Furthermore, I've arranged for the settlement of all outstanding debts. The seizure order is no longer valid. The sheriff examined the papers carefully, his expression growing more relieved with each page. These documents appear to be in order. He said finally, Miss Winters, it appears that Midnight's promise was never legally subject to seizure. In the first place, the crowd erupted in celebration. But the most remarkable moment was yet to come. As the cheering died down, Midnight's promise stepped forward and, for the third time that day, performed his incredible bow. But this time, he wasn't bowing to Magnolia or to the crowd, he was bowing to the sheriff. The gesture was so unexpected, so obviously respectful, that the sheriff felt his eyes fill with tears. In his decades of law enforcement, he had never been acknowledged by an animal in such a profound way. Well, I'll be damned, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Doctor. Thorne approached the sheriff with a knowing smile. Sheriff, in my experience, horses are excellent judges of character. I believe Midnight's promise is thanking you for making the right choice. As the sun set over the arena, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the community began to disperse, but the bonds forged that day would last for generations. People who had never spoken to each other before exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. The shared experience of witnessing something truly extraordinary had created connections that transcended social boundaries. Magnolia stood beside Midnight's promise, overwhelmed by the support she had received from people she barely knew. Cordelia Blackthorne approached her with a gentle smile. Miss Winters, the older woman said, I have a proposition for you. I've been looking for someone to help manage my horse training program. It would mean a full scholarship to the state university, plus a position working with some of the finest horses in the country. Magnolia's eyes widened. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Cordelia replied. Your grandfather was one of the finest horsemen I ever knew, and I can see his gift in you. But more importantly, you've shown that you have something even more valuable, the courage to stand up for what's right. As the last of the crowd departed, Magnolia led Midnight's promise toward the barn where he would spend the night. The stallion walked beside her with the easy grace of a partner rather than a possession, his dark eyes reflecting the contentment of a creature who had found his place in the world. Sheriff Vance approached them one final time, his badge glinting in the fading light. Miss Winters, he said, I want you to know that what happened here today changed me. Your grandfather would be proud. Magnolia smiled, her hand resting on Midnight's promise's neck. He always said that the right choice isn't always the easy choice, but it's always the one that lets you sleep at night. As they walked into the barn together, the horse turned his head one last time toward the arena where his bow had silenced a crowd and changed the course of history. The simple gesture had become something far more significant, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths are communicated not through words, but through the pure language of the heart. Years later, when people told the story of the girl who bid $1 and the horse who bowed to save them both, they would always emphasize the same point, that on that day, a community remembered what it meant to stand together, and a young woman and her horse reminded them all that some bonds are too sacred to be broken by law or bureaucracy. Midnight's promise lived to be 31 years old, spending his days training young riders and his evenings walking the pastures of Whispering Meadows with Magnolia by his side. And though he never bowed again in quite the same way, those who knew him swore that his eyes always held the memory of that perfect moment when love triumphed over law and a community found its soul.